Welcome to VCR, Vintage Cinema Rewind. We're bringing old movies to new viewers. I'm Blake.
And I'm Michael.
And today we're doing part two, our deep dive of To Kill a Mockingbird. I actually was expecting you to have some sort of quip.
Blake, I'm normally pretty quip worthy, but we were just talking about shorts and how things were trending and what our numbers looked like, and then you were just like, okay, hit record, 3, 2, 1, record, and then you jumped right into it. I had no preparation whatsoever.
Sometimes I gotta keep you on your toes.
Yeah, I guess.
How else are we gonna make exciting content?
Well, I guess I am not a ballerina today because I immediately fell over and embarrassed myself in front of everyone. Anyways, To Kill a Mockingbird. It's a classic. Gregory Peck is in it.
Yes, this is the deep dive episode of To Kill a Mockingbird. If you haven't seen To Kill a Mockingbird, go back and check out the primer episode where we explain who this movie's for, give you a brief summary of what it is.
We were just talking about how our primer episode actually did pretty well, at least in terms of our own circles. Like, there's definitely something about this movie and these characters that tracks with people. I was just telling Blake that I was visiting family for a couple days this week, and I told my mom, that Blake and I were doing To Kill a Mockingbird, and she just brightened right up, and she was like, "Oh, Atticus Finch, like, blah, 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 blah." Like, this movie and this story and this book are definitely all big cultural touchstones. You know what I mean?
To back up a second here, this is something that we don't normally do for the podcast, is to record an episode, like a primer episode, to peer behind the curtain here for a second.
Yeah, this is how the sausage is made.
Yeah, we usually record both episodes together, but sometimes timing restraints, it's just easier to record the primer and do the deep dive a little later. I don't love doing that because, then I need to watch the movie multiple times to really have this discussion and do this discussion justice.
Yeah, to peer even further back behind the curtain, Blake wanted to do both episodes earlier this week, but I was tired Monday night, and I made him split it up.
Yeah, in that case, most of the time we don't even get feedback from the primer episode before we actually release the deep dive episode. So in this case, it's really unique in a sense because we did get some feedback for the primer episode and To Kill a Mockingbird and what this movie means to people, right?
Right.
Your mom certainly had very fond memories of this film and probably goes back to her childhood, right?
Mm-hmm.
Likewise, my parents, my family and everything. And even not only just the appreciation of it, but also some of the rubbing against it also was brought up. And you kind of danced around some counterpoints that you wanted to talk about in this episode. And I think we're finally going to get to do that. But, we've already gotten to hear some feedback from people who have reflected on that in 2024.
I'm curious to see, I'm curious, did you get some counter arguments from friends and family when the primer episode came out?
Yeah, I have some teachers in my family, and so they reached out and talked to me about why they don't necessarily feel right making this book a reading requirement in English classes in high school anymore, and how they kind of agreed with something that you were kind of starting to allude to about the white savior aspect of this film. And this is something that I think we're definitely going to talk about at some point, and we might as well just get it out of the way now.
We may as well just jump right into it.
Yeah, this is probably, I think, where you're going to go with part of the issue of this film is that the black people in this film really have no agency or any characterization.
The thing that I found quite egregious is that, the whole plot kind of centers around this trial where Tom Robinson, a black man, has been falsely accused of assaulting this white woman. And Tom Robinson, the defendant, is that the right legal term, defendant? The guy who's on trial? Yeah. So Tom Robinson, the defendant, he's barely in the movie. I think he's in there for 1.5 scenes. So, and by the way, the actor who plays him, I forget his name already, but he did
Brock Peters.
Yeah, he did an amazing job. And apparently, I was reading, he also delivered the eulogy at Gregory Peck's funeral. So
yeah, he did to kind of again show how impactful this movie was to, not only obviously our parents' generation, but the people making this movie. It deeply impacted them. We'll talk about some of the effects in filming, but it sounded like a very emotional set often.
Yeah, and I could definitely believe it. But yeah, you're right. Like, the black people have very, very, very little agency. You know, for
Like, I'll bring up even something that I noticed on this rewatch, even more so than the first watch, was, when they go to Tom Robinson's family home. Yes, it's through the children's eyes, so I understand from a framing perspective and, the narrative of having Bob Ewell show up drunk and terrorizing the kids.
Yep.
But, like, even in that scene, like, Atticus goes in and has a conversation with the family, but we don't see any of that,
Yeah,
right?
Atticus goes in the door, but we stay outside.
So in that sense, like, again, it's not really doing their side justice in any of this and making them fully fleshed out characters. Like, the black people in this are almost like a writing device,
Like
in
a
a sense.
plot device or like character.
Yeah.
They're almost like a Greek chorus where like they're just sort of, I'm not using that term correctly, but like they're just kind of, like when we get to Tom Robinson's home, we see the whole family there. And yeah, we don't know any of their names. We don't know what they're about. It's just, they're just kind of there.
Yeah. And so where I really struggle in this conversation a little bit is I actually agree with all of that. Like, I think that is all.
Oh, can I just say
issues.
one more thing?
Yeah.
I also think it's a little ridiculous that Tom Robinson is murdered off screen. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I kind of wonder about that. And part of this, again, is the way that this film and this novel tell the story. It's purely through the eyes of Scout.
I can understand that, but I would have liked. It just feels a little. I made a clumsy reference to Greek tragedy a minute ago, but like, in Greek tragedies, they couldn't really show violence on stage. So when a character died, another character would just walk on stage and be like, yo, that guy's dead. And this is exactly what it felt like in this movie. It's just like, oh, Tom Robinson was killed. Sorry. Like, bleh.
Well, and because of the way it happens as well, like, there kind of puts into doubt in my mind a little bit, like, was he actually trying to run away? Like, was this a setup? Like, there's questions that can never be answered in the way that it's framed.
And again, like, I understand that the story is told through the perspective of Scout, but like, any writer worth their salt can contrive some reason for her to be there when he's killed. You know what I mean?
Right.
It would probably take half an hour's work to just be like, oh, she was chasing after a squirrel or a lost ball, and then she saw the whole thing. I'm spitballing, but you know what I mean. It wouldn't have been hard to just put her there,
Yeah, and so this gets into really the complicated nature of this story, is because at its core, if you really think about, to me, what this story is about, and I guess everybody's going to have a different perspective, right, of what the novel is about and really where the central focus is. To me, the focus of this novel, and especially if you think about even the novel and the movie together, whichever one I'm going to use, I'm just going to use interchangeably because they're essentially a very, very similar story. There's like some minor differences between the book and the novel, but for the most part here, we're dealing with the same plot and story. So if you think about this as a whole, we spend an hour in the first half with the kids and seeing the kids and the nostalgia and like seeing through their eyes this world and how their world view changes over this 3-year period, right? From 1933 to 1935. For me, I think that this is at its core a story of childhood and how our innocence is warped and changed and our worldview is warped and changed in this crucial like period in our lives in our early years, right? And how like, we start off in this world without understanding all of the hatred and all of the evil and despicableness that's in the world. Our parents, even like Atticus, like tries to shield the kids from this. Even with him shielding this, like there's plenty of times where he can't shield him from it, because the reality is like, as a parent, you can't be present with your kids through their whole lives, right? Like,
no,
at some point they're going to go off and experience things, and like kids also have the wildest of imaginations, right? And so like the Boo Radley aspect of this story it's independent of Atticus, right? Like Atticus, sure, he explains a little bit here and there about the Boo Radley,
He's kind of just
Radley
like, I
family.
want you guys to leave that family alone. Jesus.
Yeah. Yeah, and he doesn't really say much on the matter. So like all of the other information that they get about the Radleys comes from other kids or like overly dramatic housewives essentially that stay at home all day and
Miss
like
Dubois, yeah.
yeah.
I do really love that moment when she's yelling at the two kids and then Atticus comes up. He's like, "Oh, hello, Mrs. Dubois. My, you look like a picture." And then Jem is just like, "He didn't say a picture or what?" So yeah, that was funny.
Yeah, so like that's where it's really complicated, right? Is that I think that the problem here is that ultimately the racism and the social injustices are used as a prop to kind of tell this other larger story about childhood and innocence and like growing up and learning about the world and like becoming jaded almost by the world.
Yeah, and if I can just speak to that, like again, as we said in last week's episode, like I was not assigned this book as a child. I've never read it. This is my first time seeing the movie. So watching it for the first time last week, I was surprised by how little the movie actually commented on racism.
Right. That's where it's like really interesting, right? Because it feels like it's such an important topic and it's very core to the story of this film, but it also feels like a sideshow.
Feels like an accessory to the story, right?
Yeah, yeah. And it's like, and that in itself makes it somewhat questionable because it feels like it should say more. And yet that's not the story that it's telling. Yeah.
Well, and like, everybody knows, like you think To Kill a Mockingbird, you're like, oh, it's that famous book about racism from the 50s or whatever, right? 60s.
Right.
I don't know, but
60s. Yep.
Yeah, but then it very rarely. Yeah, I mean, to me,
and so
I was gonna say, to me, yeah, you're right. Like this movie, this isn't so much a movie about racism in the 1930s. It's a movie about a white child growing up in the 1930s.
Yeah, that's basically the crux of what I've been explaining the last few minutes.
Right, yeah.
And so for better or worse, again, that's what the story is trying to portray. And now here's the thing is like the other piece to this, does novels, does art have a responsibility to, champion social justice issues and make them, like the forefront of their stories that they're trying to tell, right? Like it's all really complicated.
It is certainly. I don't know, but I mean, aside from that larger question of like what role art should play in championing social causes, you also can't deny that there's something just slightly problematic. Well, not slightly. There's something problematic and condescending about the whole idea of a white savior, right?
Oh, certainly.
As much as as it's hard not to like Atticus Finch. It's hard not to get swept up in like the mystique of him, and his performance by Gregory Peck is astonishing. But the whole idea of like, here's this white lawyer come to save the black people, like it is like it's a little like, ugh, like it gives me the ick.
Yeah, I don't know. This is probably a controversial take, slightly, but I guess I have slightly less of a problem with it in this particular case, in part because of the times that it's portraying. It's portraying the 1930s. It's not at a point in time where black people would have like a big legal presence or really any presence within the law to be able to defend their case without a bunch of white jury members, because again, it's the 1930s, without a bunch of white jury members just automatically discrediting the person being up there and speaking to them, right? Like that's part of the problem with like the white savior idea is that I don't think it does history credit always. Now, Lawrence of Arabia, I think, is a white savior idea that's a little bit grosser, in my opinion.
I was actually thinking, like, Lawrence of Arabia, despite what it's portraying, like, I felt like it was a bit more, it had a bit more, like, ironic attitude to the whole white savior thing, right?
Right.
Like,
yeah.
The movie doesn't even like Lawrence all that well, and it does showcase the harm he's doing. And there are plenty of moments where the Middle Eastern characters kind of talk shit to him because they know what he's really about. Whereas To Kill a Mockingbird almost feels like the whole white savior played straighter or less ironically.
Yeah, and that's a good point, honestly. Like, and here's the other thing that kind of, plays into all of this is knowing some of the background of the writing of the novel. Like Harper Lee's father was a lawyer.
There's
in
also
Alabama,
that, yeah.
And this court case, is actually heavily based on his real experience, right? Of defending a black man wrongly accused of murder, losing, and quitting defense law because of it.
Oh, interesting. I knew that her father was a white defense lawyer. I didn't realize that he lost a case he should have won for a black defendant and then quit over it.
When you understand a little bit more of the history of that too, it's like, this is taking from personal experiences of something that somebody actually witnessed, right? And again, that comes back to a little bit like the bigger discussion here. As a reminder, like the way that this plays out is through the eyes of Scout, and from an even like wider lens through the eyes of Harper Lee, telling the story of what her childhood was like, more or less.
Interesting. I had a thought today. I was in the bathroom getting ready for this, and I was thinking to myself, like, how different would this story have been if the Finches were black?
Right, and I think that in 1970 or even the late 1960s, I think that that's a story that would be really interesting and that would make more logical sense. But I think the movie is a product of the time period in which it's telling itself in, and that's just not a reality in 1930.
Well, I don't know enough about history or the legal profession. Like, when were the first black lawyers? And, I would love to see, how sometimes like fairy tales or things get rewritten as like modern novels. I would love for like a black or a writer of color to rewrite To Kill a Mockingbird with the Finches being black or something like that, and see what that looks like. I think there might be a more gripping story there.
Well, and I think you could tell that story in taking place in the 60s or the 70s, but it just, for the time period, I don't think it works. And like, for example, I was reading a little bit about the civil rights movement, and that it really picked up pace in like the 50s into the 60s, because if you go back to like World War II, for example, at the onset of World War II, black people weren't even allowed to fight for the American army. And that was something, they had to fight for their right to fight.
Jesus.
Yeah, so
Come
like
on,
that,
America.
that's like to give you a little bit of an idea of where things sat even 10 years after this movie takes place in, right? Like, black people did not have a lot of rights at this point in time.
No, and like if I can give the movie some credit, like the fact that Atticus Finch pretty clearly demolishes the prosecutor's argument, like demolishes it with facts and logic, like the fact that he still loses the case, like that is one of the few times, or one of the only times that the movie actually showcases the systemic injustice that is prevalent throughout the United States. The fact that he pretty inconclusively proved that the prosecutor and the accusers were all full of shit, but the jury still found Tom Robinson guilty anyway. Like that
Yeah.
actually, watching this movie, I felt like the air leave my lungs when that happened. I was like, oh, like it was like I was punched in the stomach.
Yeah, and that kind of actually reading about the history of this novel and its impact in high school readings, like over the last decades that this book and movie have been out, I found it really interesting that there's a lot of writing about how different audiences react to this novel. Like, there was a lot of documentation about how in schools, white kids looked at this as a message of hope and, like, at the end, like, really loved this. And, you know, like, that's the only experience that I have with it as a white guy. I can't. I only have my experience, right? And
Yeah, for those
that
of
kind
you, I know you guys can't see us, but if you can't tell from our voices, we are two incredibly pasty, incredibly sheltered white kids.
Yeah. And then to read as well about how in schools, like, kids who were black or of other ethnicities just being devastated by the outcome of this novel, like, it, you know, it kind of paints like a different picture and a different reading that I just personally would never or could never have because just of my upbringing, like, and who I am, right? And like that's something that I think is really interesting about all of this conversation as well, right? Is that
It
at the end of the
certainly
day, like,
is.
we can really only comment on our own experiences.
First of all, I would love for our viewers, especially viewers of color, to like sound off in the comments or reach out to us because like I'm really, really curious. I think their perspective on the story would be infinitely more interesting and valid than anything you and I could come up with. So
Yeah.
yeah, I would really encourage people to reach out to us to let us know what they think. I also think I watched a PBS video. There's a YouTube channel called Storied that I think is sponsored by PBS, where they sometimes talk about classic works of literature. And I don't like doing research or work of any kind preparing for these podcasts, but I did watch that last week, and the host, I forget her name, she talked about, you know, the villains, quote unquote. No, there's no quotes, they're villains, the villains of the story, the you know, the evil white trash family that's trying to discredit and destroy Tom Robinson's life. And the host pointed out that like this really is a book kind of aimed at white people, because when you look at the villains, the book is kind of saying like, oh, you don't cause like you're not guilty of racism. Other white
Mm-hmm.
people are guilty of racism. Like, you know,
Right.
especially economically disadvantaged white people. They're the ones who are causing racism. It's not you. You're cool. So you know
Right.
what I mean? And I thought that was very, very interesting as well, you know? It's like racism isn't, there's no such thing. It's like, oh, there's no such thing as systemic injustice. It's just those poor white people that are ruining everything.
Right.
So,
Yeah, and that definitely is like a bigger discussion as well, right? Like, that there's a certain passing of the buck a little bit to a lot of things, not only, like, you know, civil rights and stuff like that, but oftentimes there's a passing of the buck for who's responsible for a lot of injustices in the world, right?
right. Yeah.
Yeah, and so it kind of feels like we're wrapping up this discussion. So I have two kind of final thoughts that I have on this part of the discussion. The first one is that this book is actually something that's cited in the civil rights movements of the 1960s as something that, you know, really started to help that movement gain traction in America and allowed people to start to maybe see some alternative viewpoints. So while we're kind of discussing some of the issues that we have with this in 2024, I think that this is a bit of a milestone piece of literature in that it does at least bring up, it allows the conversation to begin, right? And that's something to
Potentially,
its
yeah.
credit, right? Like, that's something to this film and this novel's credit is we're almost 30 minutes into a discussion about To Kill a Mockingbird, and we've spent like that last 30 minutes talking about civil rights, and we're just a silly podcast talking about movies, right? Where this isn't something that you and I would normally have any sort of discussion on. So I got to give the film and the novel credit for actually opening the door up for having this conversation.
I guess I don't know if I would agree. It was more just me talking shit for the last 30 minutes.
Yeah, but
okay.
But it's allowing us to have that conversation, though. Even if you don't necessarily agree with all of it, at least we're having a conversation about it, you know?
I suppose.
And reconciling our own thoughts about all of this with what we watched.
Yeah, I suppose.
I can't think of a lot of other movies that have really made me think about this on this kind of level. Or not that I've watched recently.
No. Definitely not. I mean, when was the last big movie about civil rights?
I feel like there have been some that have come out like over the last few years. But you know, I'm having trouble myself thinking of which ones, you know, had the most impact on me personally, right? Like,
yeah,
you know, there's some cornerstone ones like. And this is bad. Like, I don't actually know all that many cornerstone ones, like Malcolm X, America History X. Like, I've seen those. But beyond that, like, oftentimes civil rights are kind of a sideshow to whatever the plot is actually really wants to get into.
Yeah, I guess so. And I guess maybe that's really, if we can put a pin in it, that's kind of the biggest problem I have with this movie is that it doesn't really lean into that aspect enough, right? Mm-hmm. Also, should we talk about Boo Radley?
Yeah, let's go for it.
Yeah, that's another plot thread that really I kind of tripped over. So, like, for context, like, there's apparently this guy named Boo Radley who lives next door to the Finches, and there's all these weird, like, outlandish stories about all the stuff he's been up to or whatever, and there's some intrigue where like there's a tree with like kind of a hole in it, and they find like Jem and Scout find like soap carvings of them essentially, and then
a little other trinkets,
and then there's also this thing where, you know, at one point they're running away and Jem gets his pants caught in a chain link fence,
chicken wire,
something like that. He has to run back for them, and then he says that he found his pants folded and waiting for him. So there's like some intrigue being built up, and then at the end, the evil racist guy, I forget his name, attacks
Robert E. Lee.
Robert E. Lee.
Ewell.
Yeah, how could I forget that?
Bob Ewell.
Ewell attacks the kids with a knife while Scout is dressed as a ham, which I found very amusing that the little girl was dressed as a ham during the big scary climax. Like, frankly, more characters should be dressed as meat during climaxes of movies.
You know what? That would be a hilarious reference back to this movie, is like our main character dressed as a ham in climaxes of films.
Yeah, just, oh no. Yeah, so then anyways, Bob Ewell attacks Jem and Scout with a knife, and then Boo Radley appears out of nowhere and kills Bob Ewell. And then it's kind of this big moment of reveal at the end where they're all kind of trying to figure out what happened, and Scout kind of opens the door, and there he is, Robert Duvall, Boo Radley.
Who's been in like the background, like silently, practically invisible the whole like 5 minutes that they're discussing the events leading up to this moment. Right.
And then it's like they're kind of trying to decide what to do, and then the sheriff just kind of decides, oh, Bob Ewell just fell on his knife, you know, I'm not going to drag that kid before a jury and blah, 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 blah. And then Scout, earlier in the movie, what's his name? Atticus Finch talks about, you know, you can shoot a blue jay with a BB gun, but you should never shoot a mockingbird because all mockingbirds do is produce music for us to enjoy. So you should never kill a mockingbird. That's where the title comes from.
Right.
And then it's Scout at the end who says, if we prosecute Boo Radley, then that's going to be just like killing a mockingbird. And then the movie ends, and I was sitting in my chair blinking at my laptop like, what? So I don't. It just. I don't. How did that whole plot thread sit with you? Because I have thoughts.
So I guess as somebody who's read the book and seen the movie now multiple times, I think that reading the book and understanding the full context of everything makes it slightly less egregious as like a plot narrative. I think that it does more, there's more discussion about who Boo Radley is and kind of filling out his character. There's more interactions with him and the kids like than what we get. I think it's probably interwoven better. Like I don't remember the novel incredibly well, but I gotta imagine Boo Radley appears even briefly during the court case section of the novel, right? Like he's kind of just disappears for like half of the movie, like even the discussion of him, which is fine because like the movie has all their things that it needs to take care of, and we're saying that it's not taking care of those as well. And maybe that's the bigger point of this, right? Is maybe the movies and the novel are just trying to juggle too many things.
It,
and
yeah, just and I will say, just as someone who hasn't read the book, it just felt very jarring to me. Like,
right,
the movie does a good job building intrigue and all that stuff with Boo Radley, but it just felt very, especially when he shows up at the end, hiding behind the door. You're just kind of like, me, anyways. I was just like, wasn't this movie about racism? Like, what's
right.
going on here?
Yeah, and I guess again that's the problem is like we feel like it should be more about racism, but that's just not the reality of the story that's telling. It's telling the story of the children. And if you really want to dive into, I guess, Boo Radley's importance to the last part of this film, like I guess one reading you could take from that is Scout reconciling with the fact that the world is very different from her perception in 1933 as a child to what she's learned about the world even 3 years later at like 6 or 9 years old, or approximately how old she is at the end of this movie. She starts off like with this very like naive look at the world, and in this naive look at the world, everything is black and white, which is kind of
pun
funny.
intended.
Yeah, and the only real monster in the world is a monster of the children's creation, right? It's this like pure evil monster that has no motive or like reason or logic behind it. It's just a plain old black and white 1950s B-movie monster in Boo Radley. And by the end of the film, having seen in the court her father lose this case and having to reconcile with the fact that like the court system, which is supposed to be balanced and provide justice, not do that, and seeing the corruptness of not only the court system but like the town and the people that she thought were just that she was living in this idealistic world with are actually the ones that are corrupt and evil. And it's this like person who at the end who we don't get a whole lot of like motivation for, but who goes out of his way to save a couple of children. That's worth protecting, I guess, in a sense.
He's the titular Mockingbird. Yeah. And like let's just say like Boo Radley is quite clearly framed as likely autistic or some kind of, I don't know what the correct term would be, but someone who's perhaps a bit
he has like some sort of mental disability.
Sure. Yeah. So I was very taken aback by his inclusion, especially at the end. I was like, okay, like,
right.
Yeah, I don't know what to make of that. It's very, going into this movie, I was like, why is it even called To Kill a Mockingbird? And then at the end, when Scout's like, prosecuting Boo Radley would be like killing a mockingbird, I was like, wait, he's the Mockingbird? Like, okay.
Right. Well, I mean, there's probably some sort of analysis online about who the Mockingbird is throughout this movie and throughout the novel, right? Like there's an obvious case, like the blatant case is Boo Radley. There's probably also a case for Tom Robinson as the Mockingbird. There's honestly probably even some discussion online about Scout being the Mockingbird and about the Mockingbird being childhood innocence.
Maybe
childhood ignorance.
Maybe the rabbit dog that Atticus shot randomly halfway through the movie is the Mockingbird.
Right. So the obvious say it out loud like conclusion is that he's the Mockingbird, but I don't know if that's clearly the only answer to that question.
No.
I guess.
I don't really know either. I just think perhaps I need to see this movie again, or perhaps I need to read the book, but there was a lot. This movie seems to have a lot of fraying edges, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So I don't know. And perhaps this movie is sort of a victim of its own success. The book and the movie are both kind of known, at least in popular culture, as the famous book or movie about racism, when really the movie is, you're right, it's more about a white girl growing up in the 1930s Alabama. So
yeah, and like I don't want to, that's the other thing, is like I don't want to diminish that experience and diminish the importance of that viewpoint as well, right? Because I think as a narrative point, like I think that's where this movie is at its best, is when it's showing the nostalgia of childhood and like reflecting back on those moments of being a child and seeing how this child is corrupted by the world, and seeing this kid who could be anything and anyone be told, no, you have to wear a dress to go to school. And like there's a really like poignant moment in the movie where Atticus and Scout are sitting in bed, and Atticus is putting Scout to bed, and Scout asks to see his stopwatch or whatever it's called, right? His pocket watch.
Yeah.
And Scout says like, so when Jem is an adult, you're going to give him that watch, right? And he's like, yeah, I am. And Scout's like, well, why can't I have it? And it's like that really awkward moment where Atticus has to, reflect
silly.
on.
Girls don't need to know what time it is.
Yeah, but like it's kind of just like he has to sit there, and I think that's part of what also I think makes Atticus's performance, or Gregory Peck's performance, really good, is that like I can see the wheels turning whenever Atticus is presented with these kind of dilemmas, right? Like of having to protect his kids versus like give them this honest look at the world. And he usually finds a way to kind of marry both of those together. Like he kind of explains to Scout that that's kind of the way that like life works, but like eventually he does have something for her, but the reality is as well what he's going to give her again more fits in line with what society's expectation of what Scout is going to be when she becomes an adult, right?
Right. He's like, oh, well, I have a bunch of jewelry from your mom set aside that I'm going to give to you when you're older, right?
Right.
I will say, like, as problematic as the character of Atticus Finch is, like I said before, it's kind of hard not to like the guy, Like,
it's not his fault, like, that the perspective of the movie and, like, what his role as a white savior, it's not like he's valiantly taking on this role and expecting praise and admiration for the people around him.
Well, I mean, I guess you could say that the function of the character is problematic, but the character itself, yes. Like, there is kind of a reason we all, like, Atticus Finch has almost kind of become synonymous with, like, integrity and, moral rightness, you know what I mean? Again, I think the function and the role the character plays is problematic, but, like, the writing around him and the performance is truly... I actually think my favorite scene of the movie is that 15-minute courthouse sequence where we see him doing his job and just, again, very calmly and very quietly dismantling the prosecution's argument, right?
Yeah.
And you know what? There's that scene where he ends up losing despite the fact that it should have been an unquestioned victory. And there's that scene, though, where, all the black people are up in the second floor and Atticus is just kind of quietly gathering his briefcase and leaving. And
after he's lost the case.
After he's lost the case, and all the black people are standing, like, as a show of respect for him, right?
Right.
Like, all the...
And he doesn't even look up at them.
Yeah,
or
he's
anything,
just
right?
doing
like,
his job, right? Like, as problematic as the character is, there is something strangely moving about that scene.
Yeah, the, like, stand-up kids, your daddy's walking by kind of thing.
Yeah, right.
And just, the level of respect. Mm-hmm. Because, again, at the end of the day, it's not like... At no point does Atticus feel like he's doing this out of pride or out of, like, any sinister motive, right? Like, the townspeople are rallying against him multiple times, and, like, there's people who, like, for example, the obvious case is when they show up at the jail at night, and there's, like, the lynch mob ready to string up Tom Robinson there and then. And Atticus, it's not Atticus's responsibility to be there and be defending Tom Robinson physically, but he goes out of his way to do that. Like,
yeah, and we get a glimpse of his generosity, like, early on in the movie, where there's this guy who didn't have the money to pay Atticus, so he's just bringing him, like, I forget what they are, like,
bartering.
What? Yeah, bartering.
Yeah.
He's bringing him, like, walnuts, and he's just like, oh, thank you. Like, he's paying him back with, like, goods and services, which apparently is semi-autobiographical. Like, I think Harper Lee's
in the
dad.
1930s, absolutely. Yeah,
I think, like, Harper Lee's
people
dad,
literally had no money.
Yeah, basically. They were just like, I found some walnuts on my farm. Can I pay you with these? Like, sure.
Right. It's really funny, too, because this is the first time watching this movie in, like, 15 years, and I had kind of forgotten the first half of this movie is heavily focused on the children. Like, what stuck with me was the court scenes and, you know, the defense and everything. Like, as soon as like, literally as soon as the court started, I actually wrote this down as my notes, I remember everything again. But it was the first half of this film that I just completely had blanked on, right? Which is really funny because, again, like, that's the story that's being told is in the first half. Like, the core crux of the story, wants to be told, is in that part, but it's the part about the societal, structural injustice and civil rights issues that are what stick with you. So
I will say I found the first hour charming, but I thought it dragged. Like, once we actually got to the trial, I was like, oh, okay, like, I'm paying more attention.
Yeah, and it's really interesting that it's a literal, like, at the halfway point of the movie, it's literally halfway through the movie, almost exactly to the minute.
Yeah.
We switch from the childhood perspective to the court procedural.
Yeah, and it's funny because we see Scout and Jem actually get into the trial, and they go upstairs with the black people.
Yep.
Then it's like you kind of just forget about the kids for like a solid 15 minutes. We're just seeing Atticus do his job, you know?
Yeah, and that's part of what's so great about the film as well is, like, how easily and how effectively he presents his case and how engaging it is, right? Like, yeah. I wrote down in my notes again, like, it's such a basic concept, but it's so effective to present the case as Mayala Ewell was beaten by a man who was predominantly left-handed, and the guy you've presented here can't even raise his left hand to catch a glass.
Yeah, that was pretty, as compelling as it was kind of like, did the prosecution really not check on that? Like,
right.
But yeah.
I think you could even compare this to something like Killers of the Flower Moon, like a movie that, again, like a big Oscar potential movie that came out this year that has a similar complicated nature to it. It's like, and that's like a very weird look at like a white savior idea as well, because it's almost like a white anti-savior,
a white devil.
Yeah. But like, again, like, it kind of, you know, because of the story that it's telling, has to take Lily Gladstone's performance away from us for the last like hour and a half of it because of the reality of her situation in that.
And you know what's funny? My complaint about that movie is kind of the same complaint I have about this movie, where it's like, stop focusing so much on the white people.
Right. But the bigger comparison that I'm making here, though, the comparison I was starting to make here before I got off on a bit of a tangent of how much Killers of the Flower Moon and this share in common. At the end of the day, the case is pretty open and closed. Like it's not hard. Like you don't need a master's degree in criminal justice
you don't
to
need
understand.
To be Batman, no.
Yeah, to understand the facts of the case, right? Like it's such a simple, open and shut case that Atticus could never have won in 1933.
Mm-hmm.
In Alabama in 1933. I guess we should be really specific to the time period and the place in which this takes place in.
Yeah, absolutely.
The movie also has some like really interesting ideas, like not even in the sense that like, you know, this case is so open and shut, like just even in some of the like quotes that I thought, like this one is one that stuck with me for a really long time. I have nothing but pity in my heart for the chief witness for the state. She is the victim of cruel poverty and ignorance, but my pity does not extend so far as to her putting a man's life at stake. Like that to me is such an important piece of dialogue in this film, and it's something that again is stuck with me and will continue to stick with me, is that where this movie is showing the racism, right, is it's coming from the poor, impoverished people of Alabama and not having the resources, or at the point in time it's like post-depression. These people have absolutely nothing. They're barely scraping by enough to live and feed themselves, and they're looking for a scapegoat, right? And this is where like some of the sinisterness to racism and this kind of hatred and evil comes from, is people just like looking for a place to put that hatred.
I feel like we should probably talk about Mayella a little bit too. I mean, I thought she was kind of an interesting character. Like,
yeah,
she's the one accusing Tom Robinson of assaulting her, but then, according to Tom Robinson, she kind of assaulted him, or she came on to him, and then her father caught her in the act and assaulted her, and like, to me anyway, it's kind of implied that she's being physically and sexually assaulted by her own father.
Right.
And there's actually that moment when, you know, her argument is being torn down and Atticus is kind of very calmly dismantling her. She has this moment where she's like, I don't have the direct quote on hand, but it's basically something like, "You fancy people keep calling me miss, or you're trying to confuse me with your big words, like blah, 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 blah." There's something very, it's hard not to feel something for this character. It's hard not to feel some semblance of like pity for her in the desperate situation she's in, right?
Yeah, but Atticus sums it up perfectly. Like, I can pity somebody, but I also can't forgive them to ultimately what their ignorance is causing in this situation, right?
Exactly, right? And like, though my reading of it though is that she probably doesn't even want to be here. It's her dad who's forcing her to go through with this.
And that's something I actually wrote down. As soon as I remembered everything, and as soon as she sat down and that part of the movie starts where she's being examined and cross-examined, I wrote, because I remembered at that point that, and this is probably because I rewatched Holes within the last couple months.
Oh,
and
tight. Holes.
Yeah. Oh boy, does Holes have a lot of influence from To Kill a Mockingbird. Like, the connection is much deeper than I would have expected. I wrote down, like, is she doing this? Is she like throwing Tom Robinson under the bus out of fear or out of ignorance, basically?
Or out of spite because he rejected her.
Like, what is the reason? Why is she doing this? Like, what is ultimately her motivation here? Or is she just brainwashed as well, right? Like, is she brainwashed into just thinking of this community as lesser? And that was something that while I was watching this, I was like, I want to know what my answer is by the time I finish this. And at the end of the day, like, I actually didn't think it was out of fear. Like, I don't think that she was afraid of Bob. I think that it was just pure ignorance and brainwashing that caused her to like spew out all of the hate that she spewed by the end of her cross-examination.
Yeah, you know, I would really love to see like a feminist reading of this book and this movie focusing on Mayella. and I guess Scout too, right? Because they're both women in a very, 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 less accepting period of history.
Right.
So I would have loved to have learned more about that character.
And that's the thing, is like we don't get to see a whole lot of that character in this role here, because again, that's not the perspective of where this film has come from. And maybe in 2024 there could be a more complex story to be told here. Like maybe this is a film that could be redone and rewritten, like you said, and give us more perspectives of more characters, so that we could tell a more complete story and change the focus of this. But that's just not what the focus of the original novel was, right?
Right, yeah.
I want to talk about Bob Ewell for a minute, and just like how sinister of a villain he is. Like this has got to be one of the scariest villains of cinema ever.
He's definitely, I think the actress who played Scout said like many, 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 many years later that he was like, even the other actors were kind of intimidated by him.
Yeah, like it's a really scary performance. Like it's very well done. I think that every time he comes on screen, I'm kind of squirming a little bit. Like I rewatched the scene where he first comes up to Atticus while they're in the courthouse after the case has been, like, maybe the jury's been selected. I can't remember exactly where we are on the case in that point in time when the kids show up. And he says to Atticus, like, he's basically apologizing to Atticus for like having the case gone this far, and the fact that he like is being forced to defend this guy. And he's like, you see this man, like, and he's being open and honest about just his pure ignorance and hatred of black people. Like he just is just like, so like, like, I'm sorry that I have to put you through this like routine ordeal here. And Atticus pushes back hard on him, is like, I'm gonna do my job. Like you need to step back here, and like, this is not going to help at all your case. Like,
no,
I am here to uphold the law, not just like go through this same song and dance that you expect me to.
No, yeah, Bobby Ewell is very much a I woke up and I chose violence kind of guy. Like,
yeah. Like, and again, when he shows up later drunk while they're at the Tom Robinson's family's home, he's come there to choose violence. If Atticus doesn't come out in that scene, there's a question of like, what is Bob prepared to do at this moment in time?
Right. Yeah, and I don't know, as good as the performance is, I don't know that a villain like that really helps this movie all that much. You know what I mean? Again, as good as the actor is and as good as the performance is, like, I think it's indicative of a larger attitude problem with this movie, where it's like, that's who's causing racism. It's cartoonishly racist, poor, cartoonishly racist white men in overalls with straw hats. They're the ones who are causing racism. So,
yep. Well, and that's a bigger societal issue, I think, that like, again, with the time and space that we have to talk about, like I don't know that we can do that conversation justice, but I think at the end of the day, like, there are people who and institutions that would use those kind of ideas to pin people against each other, even though maybe those people don't have all that different of viewpoints at the end of the day anyway. Or maybe even care that much about stuff.
I feel like I just found Bob Ewell a little, like, as good as the actor is and as good as the performance is, I just found the character a little quaint. You know what I mean? Like, oh, look, it's Mr. Racism. Like,
yeah, like he's a caricature of that idea.
Yeah, and I feel like if this movie and this story were a little more committed to the whole racism angle, they could have done a better job with him.
Yeah, and again, we've harped on my thoughts on that more than enough at this point.
I will say the scene where he bumps into Atticus into the courtroom and he barks out like the most menacing villain laugh I've ever heard emerge from a human male's throat. I was kind of just like, okay, like, interesting.
So sequels, prequels, and reboots. So this is obviously based on Harper Lee's novel of the same name. Harper Lee is a really interesting writer because she really only wrote this novel more or less for most of her life.
And then she fucked right off.
I think, I read there's a little bit more stuff going on than that in the background of her life.
For sure.
But like this is one of the most read and most republished novels. Like I think it's been in publication or in print straight from 1960 when it was released up until now. Like they're just constantly printing it now. There's been backlash to it pretty much immediately since it's come out. There's been backlash and discussion about it and where it sits in its importance in American culture and as an American novel, like its importance and whether or not it goes far enough in some of these aspects of what it's trying to do.
So I think she was like 35 or something when this book came out. Imagine releasing a book, your first book at 35, and it being so wildly influential and so wildly successful that you don't have to do anything else for the next 60 years.
Yeah, and like that's the thing is she pretty much for novel aspects, she didn't really release many other novels after this. Like really the other big one that she released was Ghost Set a Watchman.
Oh, which was not controversial at all.
Well, and that's even strange in the sense too because it's basically considered the first draft of To Kill a Mockingbird. Like it's basically just a retelling of To Kill a Mockingbird.
Yeah, wasn't it like it was framed as like a sequel, but like on inspection it was really just a first draft?
Exactly. But I think where her life does get a little bit more interesting and how it's interconnected with American culture as well is how this is connected with another famous American writer, and that's Truman Capote.
Yeah.
So the character of Dill, the kid who shows up every summer that Scout and Jem hang out with, is based on Truman Capote because he and Harper Lee were childhood friends and they spent their summers together.
Mm-hmm.
It's really interesting because Capote also, because of all of this happening and how much inspiration Harper Lee took from her own life in this period in her life, Capote also had ideas to include story components of their lives in this period because Boo Radley was based on somebody that lived on their street or at least a story of somebody that lived on their street. And so like aspects like that. And then even the influence on Truman Capote's writing, like he and Harper Lee stayed friends throughout their lives. And when he went and did research on some of his more famous novels, Harper Lee came with him and was one of the main people helping him do research.
Yeah, apparently I don't know if this is true, but I heard that Truman Capote was kind of a dick. Like he was like, he was jealous that the book was so successful that he was kind of a dick to her afterwards.
Oh, wow.
I don't know if that's true or not, but I mean, writers are fickle, callous people, so it could very well be
Are you
true.
speaking from the heart?
What passes for a heart? Yes.
Oh, man. So effects and filming, Gregory Peck's speech that he delivers, where my favorite quote of the entire movie is included in the court, was 6.5 minutes long, and he did that in one take.
Wow.
Yeah, and he nailed it in the first take, so.
Good for him. That's amazing.
I was saying before that, like, how emotional on set this movie was. Harper Lee was on set of the film, and when Gregory Peck returns home to greet his kids after work in the early part of the film, Harper Lee actually was crying during that scene.
Aww.
And so Peck went and talked to her and said that Peck was perfect as Atticus. Like he represented her father in every way that she had written about him. So there was a lot of admiration between them. Brock Peters playing Tom Robinson, when he was crying in his testifying scenes, like that was him actually crying. That wasn't actually something they rehearsed that way. Like he was
having
like,
emotions,
actually getting emotional. Yeah, and so Gregory Peck, like while they were doing that scene together, if you watch, Gregory Peck doesn't look at him because he's afraid that if he sees Brock Peters getting emotional like this, that he would have broken down as well.
Aww.
There's a lot of emotions in the film, and even like some of the subtleties in some of the performances as well I think were really interesting. Something that I didn't notice was Mayella, when she's sworn in, she actually doesn't put her hand on the Bible. It's just above it, and that's to just imply that what she's about to say is fake.
Bullshit. Yeah.
Yeah. I think the character of Boo Radley was based on, again, a real person that lived on Harper Lee's street as a kid. I think the story was that he was involved in some sort of incident of vandalism. He had some sort of mental health issues and potentially even albinism. And that's why he only comes out at night, generally speaking.
That would kind of make sense, yeah.
Like how that affects your skin and your eyes and everything. I think the story went that his father more or less locked him in their house for like 24 years after that. And he wasn't effectively allowed to go outside until he, I think, eventually passed away in that house. So, yeah, like the story behind Boo Radley, the reality of it was pretty like awful.
Quite upsetting, yes.
Kind of going into where they shot. So the courthouse is based on a real courthouse in Alabama, but when they were shooting like the exterior shots of the courthouse, that's actually on a Universal backlot where they were shooting that. Like that's just special effects.
Special effects.
But they actually reused that courthouse for the clock tower in Back to the Future.
Really? Wow.
Yeah, so
the more
kind of
you know.
neat. And the last thing that I want to mention that I think it's a really interesting reflection on movie making and peering back the curtain on this. The director realized pretty early on in the film that he couldn't rely on doing multiple takes with the kids, just because after the first take, the kids were less spontaneous and natural.
Because they're fucking kids, right?
Yeah, so I think that's a really interesting observation that I wonder how many other directors have considered over the years or not considered. You know, like kids in film are a really contentious part of a lot of movies, right? Like,
yeah, no kidding.
You referenced like Star Wars Episode 1, but
by the way, I Jake Lloyd has eaten enough shit, you know. I
felt bad as soon as you said that.
I feel bad in hindsight, you know, like George Lucas is not known for his writing or directing abilities when it comes to actors.
Yeah.
So I would like to personally apologize to Jake Lloyd if by some chance he's missing. That was a low blow, and I'm genuinely sorry.
But no, I agree. But at the end of the day, like the reality is that that's a really interesting take to pull out of this movie. And I think, you know, like as somebody who has a passing interest in directing, like I love reading about all of these ideas and observations that directors have on set.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I would have liked to know more about how once he decided they got to get it in the first take, how did he make sure they got it in the first take? Right.
Yeah. The score is composed by Elmer Bernstein, famous composer. He did Thoroughly Modern Millie, which is a film very much known for its score. He also scored the 1991 version of Cape Fear, which you and I watched, as well as the Blues Brothers. So
fuck yeah.
Elmer Bernstein is somebody that we've crossed paths with numerous times at this point. It's one of those scores that's kind of a little bit more subdued. Like it's not one that, you know, it's bouncing around in my head like Jaws or The Godfather or something like that, but it's one that fits the film and subtly and does a really good job of that.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't notice it, but yeah, I'll agree with you on that. Although I think this is one instance where the score was kind of trying to pass unnoticed.
So I just finished reading Sidney Lumet's book. That's actually something when he talks about the score and its importance to the film, he actually, the viewpoint he had on most of his scores and most of his films was that the score should be the most important thing that the audience doesn't notice, basically. It should be something that...
That's a very smart way of looking at it.
Yeah, it should carry the emotions. It should, you know, help get the audience in the mood and try to help with the mood of what the director is trying to convey. But it's not something that should be the most prominent part of the film.
Right.
I thought that was really interesting because I think that this is a strong case for that idea in this movie. Is I think that the score, I think if you were to like watch this movie and only pay attention to the score, I think the score is really, really good in this one.
Okay. I'll have to take your word for that.
I think it's subdued and it's done in such a way that it's not something that it's not trying to overpower. This movie is already full of enough ideas and half-baked concepts and not going far enough in certain things to take away from it with the score would just be like an underserving all of these underservings.
That's a good way of putting it.
Yeah. There's enough appetizers. We don't need another appetizer before the meal.
That's even better.
It was like me and you celebrating your novel agency a couple weeks ago. I ate too many appetizers and then I struggled to eat my dinner.
Yeah, spoiler alert, guys. I've been working on novels for a long time, and I landed an agent.
Boop! I just plugged you a little bit there.
Thanks, buddy. So. You're a good friend. Anyways.
Look back at the times. So I thought I quickly mentioned this in the primer, but both of the kids retired pretty early on in their acting careers. Like Scout's actor pretty much retired right after this and became mainly a housewife raising kids.
Solid.
The kid playing Jem retired at 2022 after he essentially aged out of being a child actor and didn't feel like trying to make the jump to being a adult performer, and actually became a successful businessman in Alabama. So
good for him.
Yeah. So he did his own thing. He did what he wanted.
Yeah.
I also want to say, look back at the times a little bit as well. The movie poster, I actually quite hate.
I'm gonna pull it up right now. I'm curious.
It's just like an old, like it feels like a movie poster from the 50s. It's a little too quaint for my liking.
Quaint, eh? Let me pull that up right now. I see what you mean.
Sometimes I gotta comment. I comment on the worst of the worst posters and the best of the best, and this one kind of fits in my closer to the worst than the best.
It's very yellow.
That's just like a motif of like 1950 cinema, is very yellow movie posters. I don't know why. I'm sure that there has been somebody at some point in time has written a very great article about why the 1950s had a love affair with yellow, but I don't know the answer to that one.
I used to work in an office with garish lemony yellow walls, and that has soured my opinion on the color ever since.
Nice. Legacy of the film. So, like I said, like all of these performances, you already mentioned that Brock Peters delivered Gregory Peck's eulogy in 2003 when he passed away. The character or the actors who played Scout and Atticus became very close during the filming of this and actually kept in contact for the rest of their lives and actually called each other Scout and Atticus to each other.
Aw, that's very sweet.
So this is our Academy Awards series. This is kind of the time in the legacy where we get to talk about the Oscars and its comparison to Lawrence of Arabia. So let me read out what it was nominated for, and then we will talk some comparisons, what it won, what it lost to. So it was nominated for Best Picture, Best Actor in a Leading Role, Best Actress in a Supporting Role, Best Director, Best Writing Screenplay based on material from another medium, Best Cinematography, Black and White, Best Art Direction, Set Direction, Black and White, and Best Musical Score.
Interesting. Okay.
What do you think that it won?
Definitely Best Actor, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Best Score? I don't think so. I think Lawrence of Arabia had a better score. Best Art Direction, maybe? Is that one of the categories you said?
Yep.
Yeah, that would be my pick.
Okay, so To Kill a Mockingbird was nominated 8 times, and it won Best Actor in a Leading Role for Gregory Peck. It won Best Writing Screenplay based on material from another medium.
Mm-hmm.
And it won Best Art Direction for Black and White.
Okay, not bad, not bad.
I think the biggest one and winners and losers here is the fact that Lawrence of Arabia won Best Picture over this one. I actually tend to agree with that. I think that Lawrence of Arabia as a cinematic experience, as flawed as it was in our discussion in 2024, I think, reflecting on the time period, I think that, it's a masterpiece of the 1960s that doesn't quite hold up to a modern watch, but its importance in cinema can't be understated. Like we talked about and I highly recommend going back to the deep dive for Lawrence of Arabia and talking about its influences on the directors of our parents' generation.
Yeah, I don't know that I would agree. I just personally, as problematic as these movies were, I think I enjoyed this movie more than Lawrence of Arabia.
And that's the thing is like
Lawrence of Arabia was definitely a showcase of old Hollywood spectacle, but I think this movie, despite how half-baked or how appetizery it could be, had more to say.
So here's where I land on that. To Kill a Mockingbird, in my opinion, holds up significantly better as a piece of entertainment than Lawrence of Arabia does.
Agreed.
But in 1963, at the 1963 Oscars, I think Lawrence of Arabia is just so much more cinematic. It's so much more influential. It's not like To Kill a Mockingbird is a movie that directors and filmmakers reference as having a significant impact on them and their storytelling in the future.
That's a good point. Yeah.
Whereas like what we talked about in the Lawrence of Arabia discussion, directors like George Lucas and Steven Spielberg, even like the writing of Dune and clearly in Denis Villeneuve's Dune, like the reflections and self-reflections of a movie like Lawrence of Arabia and the impact that it had, for the most part, the generation of directors of the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and the influence that it had on those films. Like Star Wars wouldn't have existed without something like Lawrence of Arabia. Dune, as both a novel and a film, wouldn't exist without Lawrence of Arabia. I just think that To Kill a Mockingbird has like a different influence on the culture than Lawrence of Arabia does.
Yeah, I will concede that point, certainly. And like if we talk about the actual directing and filmmaking, it's certainly not as flashy as Lawrence of Arabia. It's
right.
Much quieter and more understated.
Yeah, and not to say that that's a bad thing. It's just slightly less cinematic, and I think that to me, like Best Picture to me is like the best movie of the year for the sum of its parts, right? It's like everything coming together, and I think Lawrence of Arabia at that point in time is just so much more important to film history. Whereas on the flip side, let's talk Best Actor. I think Gregory Peck just overwhelmingly deserved to win Best Actor, which he did win over Peter O'Toole.
Peter O'Toole, for sure.
I think Gregory Peck, like, this is one of the best performances in film ever. And, like, we kind of harped a little bit on, like, what his role is in this film and maybe some of the problems that the questions that we've got to ask in 2024. But it's still an achievement at what he's able to do in this role.
It's a tour de force, certainly. I think you said it best last week. It's one of the best quiet performances,
Yeah. So I think you and I are on the same page for that one. I guess at the end of the day, like, is there any other awards that you think that Lawrence of Arabia might have won, that To Kill a Mockingbird won, that you wouldn't agree with? Lawrence of Arabia, like, it won Best Picture, Best Director, didn't compete with, like, Best Art Direction and Cinematography because the black and white and the colored at this point in time being two different awards. Best Musical Score it won, which I gotta agree, like, if you're thinking about a film score that's loud and in your face and part of the main DNA of what you take away from something like Lawrence of Arabia, like, then I agree with that. I guess at the end of the day, like, I don't actually disagree with what the Academy did in 1963 with which awards they gave to which people here.
I guess not. No, I have no real grievances about that.
And, like some of the other awards, like Best Supporting Actor, Best Supporting Actress, like those didn't go to either of these movies, funny enough. On the flip side, though, like the two movies that did win in those categories were The Miracle Worker and Sweet Bird of Youth, which are both films that I have absolutely never heard of.
Me neither. So maybe if we, maybe someday. Sound off in the comments if you're big fans and want us to do that.
Yeah, so I really just I have no idea what either of those is about. I guess it looks like The Miracle Worker is about Helen Keller, and Sweet Bird of Youth is a Paul Newman film. So I mean, I'd probably be interested in actually doing that at some point. But I feel like those are like more of the films that you would expect to see awards from at the Academy Awards. Not to say that To Kill a Mockingbird isn't a film that is both, in my opinion, a very good movie. Like, even though we're going to get to our personal opinions very soon, but even though there's all of these issues with it, I still actually really enjoy this movie. But, Lawrence Arabia and To Kill a Mockingbird in the 60s feel like more widespread appeal movies than a lot of the movies that get nominated for awards and best pictures now in our current era of Hollywood.
I agree. So should we move on to our personal reviews?
Yeah, I think that is everything. Oh, I did want to actually say one other thing in the legacy here, or a couple other things in the legacy here. The other cool thing about this movie is the courthouse that they filmed inside of is actually still exists in Monroeville. And so every year, what they do is the community does a play based on the book, and they do it on the grounds of the courthouse and inside the courtroom. So the play has like very, very high reviews. What's really interesting about it is they have no trained actors that do the performance every year. It's just people from the community that take part in the performance. And so it's something that you can go check out every year. Apparently the tickets sell out almost immediately as soon as they go out every year. So you're going to have to do a little research on that, because I didn't have answers for you.
That's really special though. I'm proud of that.
Yeah. And just like in the movie, actually, this is something that I wanted to mention and kind of forgot about, is just like in the movie, the courthouse isn't air conditioned. So that was kind of one of the thoughts that I had in this movie, is that like taking place in the summer of 1935 in that courthouse with all of those people in there, it would have been sweltering.
Yeah, I don't think I'm that curious. I don't think I'm curious enough to brave all that. I'm already a very sweaty person, so I would not, you and I would not survive. I'm sweating right now and I'm not even doing anything.
Yeah. Atticus Finch voted #1 screen heroes of the last 100 years by the American Film Institute.
Okay, fair enough.
And in their special 100 Years, 100 Movies, and 100 Heroes and Villains back in 2003. So he is somebody who has lived on in the culture in part because of his performance. Actually, this is kind of funny. Gregory Peck, after he won his Oscar, said that the reason why he thought he won was in the scene where he walks out of the courthouse and everybody stands silently for him. He was like, that was the scene that won me an Oscar, basically.
The scene where he wasn't even really doing anything.
Yeah, it was just like the just pure emotion of that scene was what he thought won him the Oscar.
Yeah, maybe.
Probably not wrong.
Probably not, no.
And Mary Bedham, girl who played Scout, was 9 years old when they started filming. She was the youngest girl to get an Oscar nomination and lost to Patty Duke, who was 14 years old in The Miracle Worker, another child actor.
Nice try, kid. Better luck next time. Just one thing, that 100 Heroes, 100 Villains list from 2003, do you know who the #1 villain is?
Darth Vader?
Hannibal Lecter.
Yes. Okay, that makes sense.
I could see that. Darth Vader is #3.
Who's #2?
Norman Bates.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense. I've never actually seen the original Psycho.
Oh my god, this is the one time where you haven't seen a movie and I have.
Yeah, my Alfred Hitchcock filmography experience is full of holes, actually.
Mine
I've only
too.
seen like 2 or 3 of his movies.
Oh, we did see Vertigo together a couple years ago, and we both had opinions on
Underwhelmed.
it. Yeah,
We were both whelmed.
whelmed.
No, North by Northwest was incredible though, so
Oh, that's right. You and Jason did North by Northwest. I think that was before I was officially a part of the podcast.
yeah, that was I think our first Oscar series because that movie came out the same year as Ben-Hur, which is like, one of our favorites of probably one of our favorites of this series. It's certainly I think for our Oscar series probably second place for me cuz I mean The Godfather,
Oh,
but
fuck yeah, The Godfather all the way.
Ben-Hur, like honestly, we talked about it in Lawrence of Arabia, but I think Ben-Hur just stands the test of time significantly better than Lawrence of Arabia does.
Oh, for sure.
But anyway, personal reviews and the partner factor.
I could not convince my partner to watch this movie with me, but
Really?
no, but personal reviews, yeah, despite the many flaws with this movie, I did like it. I didn't love it, but I liked it. There are some scenes from this movie that I think will be burned into my brain for all time.
Right.
But yeah, I'd give it like a 7 out of 10.
I'm certainly higher on this one. I think that this is a classic, and it's something that we talked about in the primer. There's a very specific point in your life in your teenage years where I think watching this as a teenager not only important for a little bit for nostalgia purposes to start to like develop thoughts and start having like conversations like this, I think is really interesting, even though this movie doesn't always necessarily go far enough. And honestly, I think this is just a classic. Like, I really think that this holds up well as a viewing experience, even though there's like some civil justice issues, civil rights issues that are apparent here, and the way that the movie has framed things. But at the end of the day, like what the story that it's presenting and the perspective that it's presenting, I think are really effective in that I understand who Scout is, and so I think that the ultimate tragedy of this story is that the person that Scout should be able to be versus what the reality of the world is going to present her with. But I think that at the end of the day, the problem is that we've talked about in this episode is that the movie also touches on all of these other bigger issues and tries to kind of tackle too many things while presenting something a little bit smaller and something a little bit more personal in Scout's life, right?
Yeah.
So at the end of the day, like I enjoyed it for the aspects that it does really well and the nostalgia and everything. Well, I can also criticize like some of those issues and kind of sit somewhere in the middle there. I think that I enjoy this one more than Jess did. She's also seen this one. She also watched this one in high school. I guess my question to you is like, after this Oscars series, is there one movie that you preferred over the other? Is there one movie that you think you're more likely to rewatch at some point?
I don't think I'm going to ever rewatch Lawrence of Arabia. I do think I'm going to rewatch this movie, To Kill a Mockingbird.
I actually completely agree with you on that one. Like I really can't see myself going back to Lawrence of Arabia, in part because of the movie length and the issues that you and I had with it. Like I think they're just fundamental issues with the viewing experience that I just don't care to like subject myself to again.
Subject yourself to, yeah.
Yeah. But like with this one, there's some beauty in this film and in all of the hatred and evil. Like there's some really touching moments and it captures some feelings of childhood and nostalgia that very, very few other pieces of cinema have been able to do.
Yeah.
Like I would put this on the same pedestal of childhood nostalgia as like this, like Stand By Me, The Goonies, like all of these kind of childhood classics kind of thing.
I will say, yeah, this movie certainly does. It made me feel more human emotions than Lawrence of Arabia ever did.
I agree. I don't think I'll ever reread the book just because I struggled now a little bit more with time-wise to get through books,
You still
which is
have
probably
to,
a shame.
it's a shame that you made friends with a writer then, because I'm gonna have a very demanding catalog to throw at you.
Great. I just don't have the same time to read books, and I think in part like that's going to in some way diminish like my enjoyment of the movie over time. Like that's kind of the thing, right? Is if I think this is a very, very, very good movie that's like usual likely helped by having read the book first.
Yeah, perhaps.
Yeah.
I would like to read the book. Like, I've read some excerpts from it, and I would like to read it at some point.
Yeah.
But I also have quite a backlog to get through, so we'll see.
So it's the pot calling the kettle black.
I was going to make a really dumb joke, but I actually, for once in my life, I actually restrained myself.
I think that's all I want to talk about today.
You know, it's funny. I was talking to my girlfriend before we started recording, and I was like, I don't know that I have... She was like, how long are you going to be recording for? And I was like, probably only like an hour and a half or something. And she's like, oh, and I was just like, probably only like an hour and a half. Like, we're only doing the deep dive. And like, I don't actually think I have that much to say about this movie. And she's like, well, you didn't think you had much to say about Lawrence of Arabia, and you were recording for like 4 hours. And I'm looking at the time right now. I'm like, yeah, like we always find something to talk about, don't we?
I mean, there's plenty of stuff to talk about in this movie in particular.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, well, that's it for this episode then. Next week, we've got Roadhouse, which I'm very much looking forward to. The original Roadhouse, because I know that the new one's coming out as well simultaneously.
Apparently the new one is getting good reviews. I have heard.
I'm interested in seeing what the experience of that one's going to be. And we'll talk about in lots of detail the original, but the original captures a certain mood to it in that the movie is awful, but in the most fun way possible.
Okay.
That only by pure accident could you ever achieve.
Brandon Sanderson has a theory that good movies are only made by accident, so maybe good bad movies are also made by accident.
Right.
So
yeah, fair enough.
I guess sometimes art is just a series of happy accidents.
There we go. Our Bob Ross quote will end on that.
Yep. I guess
we'll see you next time.
Yep. Tell your dad.
Tell your dad.
Tell your dad.
Tell your dad. Tell your dad.
Tell your dad.
Bye.
Bye.